have a terrible memory for sermons. No offense to any of our gifted preachers, but after a sermon, I usually think, that was lovely, and promptly forget everything I heard. By lunchtime, I can remember how a sermon made me feel, but very few of its details, even the ones that I wrote myself. So it's notable to me that the only sermon I remember from my childhood was one given by Ed Wills. I was a teenager at a youth retreat weekend sitting in the outdoor chapel at Camp Mitchell, and Ed was preaching about board games. I have no idea if he was trying to be hip or keep our attention or what, but he went through a very detailed, very animated explanation of the differences between the games of Trouble and Sorry. Or maybe it was Monopoly. Like I said, the details were a little bit fuzzy. But the gist was this. God has designed our world to operate by a certain set of principles, like the makers of Sorry designed their board game around a certain set of rules. If you ignore that reality and try to play Monopoly on a Sorry board, it's a recipe for frustration. It just doesn't work. But you gotta know which board game you're on so that you know what the underlying principles are and what the pieces were designed to do. That's what makes the game fun. A similar dynamic is at the heart of today's readings and today's place in the church year. The whole point of the church calendar is to move us through time in a way that's different from our linear secular calendar. Our calendar is a circle. For half of the year, the season after Pentecost, we dwell on the story of the people of God. For the other half of the year, which encompasses Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Lent, and Easter, we dwell on the story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. In this cycle of lived faith, today is a pivot point. It's like liturgical New Year's Eve. Today, the last Sunday after Pentecost, is known as Christ the King Sunday. Next Sunday, the church calendar starts over again, and we begin a new year on the first Sunday of Advent. It's beautiful and fitting that, like many of you, Andrea was the first person who taught me how to live this cycle of faith and modeled how to live into these rhythms and let the church calendar shape my own household traditions. So we have board games and peculiar calendars, and they are both getting to the core question: where does your allegiance lie? What calendar dwells at the center of your heart and home? Which board game are you on? Today's readings, most especially our gospel readings, serve to remind us what kind of board game God designed, what God's kingdom or God's reign looks like. Our gospel reading finds Jesus, our victor, our model, and our guide, as a captive. His kingdom is being mocked, and he is being interrogated by Pilate, and he refuses to give a straight answer or defend himself. His resistance to the powers that be, his refusal to play nice on their board game, will cost him his life. Now, if a marketing department were in charge of Jesus' branding and given the task of picking any story from his life that makes the strongest case about his identity and his mission, this story would be an unlikely contender. If one wanted to celebrate the reign and power of God, wouldn't it be better to pick something that involved wind and voices and majestic and wondrous signs and triumph? Wouldn't it? No, that's not the kind of power Jesus wields. And the church is not a PR firm. In the words of theologian Debbie Thomas, Jesus' chosen path to glory is humility, surrender, brokenness, and loss. This is the peculiar way of our guide, Jesus. This is the King's highway. He could have taken any path to glory, and the one he picked is distinctly inglorious. Now, there's an interesting thing happening behind the scenes of this Inquisition story. Pilate is going back and forth from an inner room where Jesus is being held to an outer room or courtyard where the leaders who had Jesus arrested are waiting. because Passover was coming, and the authorities wouldn't have had time to redo their purification rituals if they entered the Roman palace, which they believed to be a profane space. So they waited outside. They stayed on the straight and narrow of their own path. This snippet is just one of those movements, but there are 7 total times that Pilate travels from where Jesus is being held to the outer courtyard where the authorities are waiting and back again. 7. Whenever you hear that number, you should know that it's like a biblical neon sign saying, pay attention, this is important. The author of John is depicting in Pilate's very movements the contrast between 2 different paths of leadership, the ways of the world and the ways of Jesus. What kind of way is Jesus's way? One that makes no sense if you're trying to play by the rules of the world. Jesus's way is one where the last are first, the weak are strong, where dying leads to life, where you love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, where the poor and the powerless and those deemed as pathetic are lauded as the ones seated at God's right hand. What a weird kingdom. Jesus' way, his highway, is not beholden to the logic of this world. When we walk the King's highway, we are beholden to and called into relationship with the logic, the logos of God, the Word made flesh, Jesus the Christ. And this logos, this reign of God, looks very different and cares about different things than the reign of this world. As people following the way of Jesus, our lives should look different than someone following only the ways of this world. So my question for you, friends, is which highway are you on? One of the things I've appreciated most about your leadership, Ed, is your clarity of vision. You know which highway you're on, and you redirect us when we're tempted to set cruise control or change lanes into the stifling highway of other people's expectations. You and Andrea have helped us remember that our gift, our freedom, our glorious liberty as children of God gives us permission to do peculiar things, to live by a different calendar, to organize our time, our households, our money, our ambitions, our relationships differently, to bring them more closely into alignment with God's reign here on earth. You have reminded us of that freedom and then been the first to show us what it looks like to walk a different path than the ways of the world, to set our feet on a path of right relationship, of righteousness, a path that leads away from death and toward life everlasting. You walk the King's highway, and you have led us faithfully on that path for 17 years because you too have been on it for the better part of your life. Ed, as you've said before, there is a consistency of purpose in this dance of Holy Communion that has run through your entire life. When you became ordained, you just started standing in a different place in the liturgy. As we bid you to farewell, to go and stand in a different place for a while, we are buoyed and strengthened by your example. We are going to continue on the King's highway, to continue practicing Holy Communion as you have taught us. Though our physical paths may diverge for a while, we are still walking in the same direction, the way of life and truth. We are all on the King's highway. Thanks be to God. Amen.